All right, welcome everybody. This is the Junior Scholar Seminar with Rebecca Y on doing surveys in Singapore. Rebecca is a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan, where she works on comparative politics, largely looking at immigration issues. So this is a co-authored paper she has with Charlotte Carrier, and what they try to examine is attitudes towards immigrants. The general view is that high-skilled, high-income immigrants tend to be more accepted. They are seen to be net contributors to society, but that takes a baseline looking at, in most cases, developed countries in North America and Europe. Whereas what Rebecca wants to do with Charlotte is to look at the Singapore context where the institutions are a bit different, right? And to examine how immigrants, including high-skilled immigrants, are seen by the local population. So Rebecca will talk for about half an hour or so, and we'll have our discussant, Elvin Ong, who's my colleague at the Department of Political Science at the National University of Singapore, and he will be giving comments for about 5 or so minutes. And I realized I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Ian Chong. I'm a political scientist. I work at NUS. Of course, I'm here in my personal capacity as a co-editor of Academia SG, which is a collective that promotes scholarship on Singapore for Singaporeans. And at the same time, I also work on international relations more broadly. But at any rate, let me not take up more of your time and turn things over to Rebecca. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Academia SG, for letting me present this work. Thank you so much, Elvin, for being our discussant. I'm Rebecca Y. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan in the political science department. So I do work on immigration and refugee politics, but my case study is usually Uganda. So my dissertation is on farmer groups in Uganda that have both refugees and Ugandans and how they economically cooperate. So very different setting than Singapore, but I really want to expand my understanding of immigration politics, especially attitudes towards immigrants all over the world. And I'm really happy to be able to work on Singapore, which is my home country. And this project came out of taking a class with my co-author, Charlotte Cavay. So the course was on immigration policy in the West specifically. And through this class, I was thinking to myself that even though Singapore has a lot of similarities to a lot of the Western countries that we looked at, it's developed, highly educated population, immigrant receiving country because of our good economic conditions. A lot of the assumptions and theories did not apply to Singapore. And I thought deeper about it, after the course, and I approached Charlotte about a project to bring these theories and literature that were really formed in the West to Singapore. And I think we're hoping to, apply it to other East Asian developed economies too. Just because we think, of course, it's important to broaden and speak to different contexts rather than the West. So thank you again for allowing us to present this work. And our project is called the Immigration Consensus Revisited, the case of Singapore. And sorry, can everybody see my screen? Sorry. Okay. I think I should be sharing my screen now. Yeah, okay. So the reason why it's called the Immigration Consensus is because in the American, and as well explain the Western literature in general, there is a consensus that people prefer highly educated, highly skilled immigrants across even, so, okay, sorry. Let me explain. Sorry. So if you this is a conjoint experiment, and this conjoint experiment was run by Haymuller and Hopkins. It's a well-known experiment in this literature. So if you're not familiar with a conjoint experiment, what it is that they present people with different profiles in order to understand what their preferences. And this comes out of marketing literature. So as you can see here, we've highlighted in the profession, people prefer research scientists and doctors, so highly skilled professions, much more to lower skilled professions like janitor, waiter, and same for education. They much prefer immigrants with a college and graduate degree to no formal education. And this preference is the same for both low-skilled and high-skilled natives. So in another paper where they looked at the different education levels of natives and asked them about both low and high-skilled immigration, you see that both those that have college degree and graduate degrees at the top and those who are high school dropped out at the bottom, they actually both prefer high-skilled immigration to low-skilled immigration. And sometimes people think that, oh, because immigrants, it's a job competition issue, right? You would expect low-skilled immigrants to dislike low-skilled immigrants but have no preference towards high skill, and then high-skilled immigrants to dislike high-skilled immigrants but have no issue with low-skilled immigrants because there's no job competition. But here you see that both low-skilled and high-skilled natives actually prefer high-skilled immigration to low-skilled immigration. And while this comes out of the American literature, we do see that this is replicated in Western Europe. In Elvin et al. Paper, very recent this year, they say we demonstrate that what past studies have called an immigration consensus in the United States or Western Europe may be in reality a global consensus, although more research is needed on attitudes towards immigrants in Global South. So that's why we call it an immigration consensus, because here they say, like in the literature, they take what they found in the American and the Western Europe context to be a global consensus. And oftentimes the interpretation of this consensus is that people have a sociotropic reasoning, meaning that they prefer immigrants who have the greatest positive impact on the national economy, the country. And it is about the economic and fiscal benefits. So they prefer high-skilled, highly educated immigrants because they require less welfare and they consume less public goods. So they're not a fiscal burden and they are a net economic contributor. However, this assumes a very specific institutional context in which immigrant rights are not conditioned on their skill level. So in the US, in Europe, both high and low skill immigrants have access to family reunification. They can bring their families with them. Public goods like education, healthcare, means tested social benefits, and fairly redistributive social insurance, more so in Europe than the US. So this project asks, what happens when these rights are not conditional on skill level, like in Singapore? So in Singapore, as many of you probably know, rights are very conditional on skill level. Low skill immigrants, they enter on a work permit, and they usually work in hard low skill jobs that most Singaporeans do not want, like domestic workers, manual laborers, construction. However, some low skill preferences are reserved for PRs and citizens, taxi drivers being one of them. People on a work permit cannot bring their families, and employers are totally responsible for the provision of housing and healthcare, and they don't have any path to citizenship and residency. They have to go home after their work permit ends or find another job. High-skilled immigrants, on the other hand, who enter on an S&E pass visa, they can bring their families and put their children in public schools, and they do work in the same positions as many Singaporeans who are a generally higher educated population. And they can apply for permanent residency for the E-Pass after 6 months, and then for an S-Pass after 3 years. And being a PR gives you access to healthcare, housing subsidy, and housing like for the HDBs. So what does this mean? So this means that for the fiscal burden of immigrants, high skilled immigrants actually have a higher fiscal burden than low skilled immigrants because low skilled immigrants are completely dependent on their employers for any kind of provision of housing and healthcare, whereas high skilled immigrants do have a path to citizenship and PR, thereby giving them access to public goods. And in terms of job competition, we predict that high skill natives do feel more job competition because to the high skill immigrants, whereas low skill Singaporeans might not as feel as much competition. And for for Singaporeans towards low skill immigrants, while it's possible that low skill Singaporeans do feel competition, it's lower than what high skill Singaporeans would feel towards high skill immigrants. Just because low skill Singaporeans are likely in protected jobs. And for cultural difference, as we will talk about later, because we have a lot of we want to test the attitudes towards mainland Chinese immigrants specifically. We do think that low skill immigrants do have a higher cultural difference than than high skilled immigrants, but we're also not quite sure because it's a bit of a complicated context with a lot of with what we see in the news, animosity towards mainland Chinese immigrants. So just a bit about Singapore's demography. So we have right now about 6 million people, 60% are citizens, 9% are PRs, about 12% are on a S or E pass with a path to PR, and 18% are on work permit with limited rights and then no path to PR. So what it means is about 4/10 of people living in Singapore are immigrants, with half being low-skill immigrants with little to no rights, and then the other half being high-skilled immigrants with some rights and a path to citizenship. So here we propose replicating the immigration consensus in Singapore. We measure by measuring support for high versus low skill immigrants, and we predict that it does not replicate in a Singaporean context. We also want to measure beliefs about the economic and fiscal impact of high versus low skill immigrants. And here we predict that people will perceive high skill immigrants as more of a net cost than low skill immigrants for all the reasons that I stated previously, including job competition and fiscal burden, having access when they're PR to a lot of public goods. And of course, we need to check that these beliefs are actually rooted in understanding of the Singaporean context. So what are contributions? So the first is to test this immigration consensus on a non-Western sample with strong theoretical expectations. If we do fail to replicate the immigration consensus, it would support conventional interpretations of it. However, if it does replicate, we do need to rethink these interpretations because it doesn't have to, Singapore doesn't have the same conditions as Western countries and the US. And second, we just think it's important to collect data on immigration preferences and beliefs in Singapore because immigration still continues to be a hot issue in Singapore. And we plan on running 2 surveys. In the follow-up study, we'll be building on on the first survey to understand what exactly is driving anti-immigrant sentiment in Singapore if it exists. Although we are quite sure it exists because in the 5th wave of Asian barometer, they found that 60% of Singaporeans think that the immigration flow should be restricted. We also think it's an important case for students of anti-immigration sentiment because Singapore is a case where anti-immigration sentiment is not restricted just to low-skilled natives like in the West. In the West, you do see that low-skilled natives are more negative on immigration. So here we explain a few parts of our survey to get your feedback. So number one, of course, we explicitly test whether we can replicate this immigration consensus in Singapore. And our expectation is that both low and high skilled Singaporeans want to restrict high skilled immigration more than low skilled immigration. And how we do this is that we split we do a survey experiment. We are splitting the respondents into 3 different groups where we ask about low-skilled immigrants, high-skilled immigrants, and then all immigrants, which are control. So these are the treatments that we'll be giving them. We'll be presenting, first of all, what high skill, low skill, and low skill job is. So for a high skill job, we explained that it's a job that requires an advanced degree. And in Singapore, we refer to these jobs as PMET, and it's common to call these high skilled jobs, and the immigrants become high skilled immigrants. Whereas a low skill job does not require extensive education. They can get workers can get trained in a few days or weeks, and it's common to call these immigrants who work in low skilled workers or low skilled immigrants. And for the control, we don't show them either one of these prompts. And then we ask them about their opinion about whichever group that they were shown the prompt for. And here we tell them, some people think that the number is too low, some people think it's fine, or some people think it's too large. And where would you situate yourself in the debate about immigration flows here? And we want to also examine the mechanisms that push these attitudes of immigrants. So we are focusing, first of all, on the perceptions of immigrants. Sorry? Okay, sorry, I thought I heard something. First of all, the perceptions of immigrants' economic and fiscal costs. And our expectation is that high-skilled immigrants will be perceived as more of a fiscal and economic threat than low-skilled immigrants because of their path to residency rights. So we're going to be asking about the perceived impacts of immigrants on quality of life aspects. And here we're also going to be asking about specifically immigrants from mainland China, because we want to check if our results are driven by concerns about mainland Chinese immigrants specifically. And if it's true that it is driven by PRC immigrants specifically, it could suggest that cultural concerns are more important than concerns over the material aspects of immigrants. So our respondents will be randomly asked about one of 4 groups. So all immigrants, which is our control group, immigrants from mainland China, high-skilled immigrants, and then low-skilled immigrants. And first, we're going to be asking them, if Singapore accepts more of one group, do you think it will have a negative impact on your future access to high quality and affordable? And we'll be asking them about various public goods like HDB housing, public transport, public schools, healthcare, and then also private housing, because we know that there's been a lot of in the news about how foreigners come in and buy even private housing, thereby restricting our housing stock. They will be also asking them about how they think immigrants affect the quality of their neighborhood, and about whether immigrants will have a negative impact on their future access to high quality and well-paid jobs. The other mechanism that we would like to test is this immigration numbers versus rights trade-off argument, where the literature has found that in surveys that people do accept more, like a bigger immigration flow, if the rights of these immigrations are restricted, and vice versa. And we do expect that this to hold true in Singapore, where if we restrict rights of immigrants, they will be more accepting of increasing immigration. We will also investigate the impact of immigrant social rights versus the country of origin, specifically, again, mainland China. This is a further test of whether immigrant hostility is driven by hostility towards mainland Chinese immigrants. And for this, we'll be presenting them with we'll be doing a survey experiment where we present them with a new immigration policy that either increases or decreases the number of immigrants, and they'll be randomly presented with these immigrants being from abroad, which is our control, or mainland China. And we'll tell them that this policy is either restricting or expanding their right to bring their families to settle in Singapore and receive benefits. And then we'll ask them how much they agree with this policy. And once again, for this question, we do expect that if the policy restricts their rights, they are okay with it, with the immigration policy increasing the number of immigrants. So here we also want to test a very key assumption, which is whether Singaporeans have a basic and accurate understanding of the knowledge of Singapore's immigration policy, because if they don't, then a lot of the results a lot of our results would have to be interpreted differently. So first we asked about the existence of asylum and refugee programs, which we don't have. We asked them about the number of undocumented immigrants in Singapore, whether they understand the process of acquiring work visas, and we also asked them about whether it's possible to convert high and low skill work visas to PR. And just to repeat, only high skill work visas can be converted to PR. And I will be also asking about the government's policy towards the ethnic makeup of PRs. And I'm not sure whether people in the audience know this, but the government has said in Parliament that when they look at who they approve for PR, they do take into account the demographic ethnic makeup of Singapore. And last, we asked them about what kind of access PRs have to benefits that citizens have. So we also want to make sure that Singaporeans have a fairly accurate understanding of the demography of Singapore's immigration population. So first, we want to know what kind of stereotypes Singaporeans have about immigrants. So we asked them what type of immigrant do Singaporeans have in mind when they think about immigration, and about both low-skilled and high-skilled immigrants. And we asked them about what they think their general age is, their gender, their industry, their ethnicity, and their level of English. We also want to examine perceptions of the stock and flow of immigrants. So we ask them, of 100 people living in Singapore, how many do you think are born abroad and came to Singapore for work, and how many do you think are Singaporeans born in Singapore? And then we also ask of the immigrants who come to Singapore, how many of them actually want to become permanent residents? This is to kind of see if they think that becoming permanent residents is very easy. So we can't find the statistics about how many applications put forth are actually approved, but very anecdotally, it seems that 1 in 7 or 1 in 10 are approved. So it's actually quite difficult to become PR, even for those who are eligible to apply. So of course, we have to ask, do people care about immigration policy? And we ask them, we know from many surveys that hostility towards high-skilled immigrants are often tied to concerns of a job and housing competition. So we both asked them about immigration, about what issues they care about, but then we also asked them specifically about cost of living and job concerns. And then we compared these responses to see if immigration is more commonly mentioned for one or the other. So that is our survey. And we would really appreciate feedback on whether you think these questions are actually hitting at what we want to find out. We also really rely on your deep contextual knowledge to help us, because even though if I'm Singaporean, I don't actually work in Singapore. So it'd be really helpful if you think okay, maybe this question isn't worded quite right, and we're very happy to to hear suggestions about wording. So thank you once again, and thank you, Elvin, for being our discussant.
Thank
Great.
you very much, Rebecca. Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Rebecca, for that presentation. So I'll try to keep my comments short, because I'm sure there's lots of interesting comments from the audience as well. Some of them are already in the chat. And I know this is very much a work in progress, right? You guys haven't even fielded the survey. You guys want feedback for the survey. So I have a couple of suggestions in terms of concept, in terms of presentation in the paper. If this becomes a future paper, one paper or two paper, or maybe even three papers, right? What you should potentially kind of foresee and in the paper. And then also maybe a couple of suggestions on the different parts of the survey, which I think maybe can be tweaked a little, right? So the first thing would be the concept. And I really kind of, admire you guys for tackling this uh, question about immigration in Singapore. Just as it is written in the paper and it is written in and it is presented just now, I'm a bit confused as to what is exactly the dependent variable that you're trying to look at. Sometimes the dependent variable is seen as support for immigration. Sometimes the dependent variable is seen as hostility towards immigration. Sometimes the dependent variable is perceived as a threat to immigration. And sometimes the dependent variable is whether you want to restrict immigration, right? So I think at this moment in time, there seems to be a lot of dependent variables. As I understand it, the immigration consensus, which you mentioned, was mainly focused on whether you support more or less immigration in general, right? So I'm not exactly sure whether you want to stretch conceptually, right? The idea that, oh, support for high-skilled immigration means no less hostility towards, high-skilled immigrants, right? Because that may be talking about like different things. So, for example, like intuitively, yes, I might support, high-skilled immigration, but maybe I think, oh, there's already a lot of high-skilled immigration, so we don't need more, right? So which you can actually probe in your questions. So I think to be very precise and careful about what exactly is the dependent variable you are trying to think about in Singapore and what you're trying to actually measure, right, through your questions, I think will be important as like just a first step, right? Just as clearing the ground, I'm planting my flag to say, this is the precise thing which I want to measure, be it support for, be it hostility, be it perceived as a threat, so on and so forth, right? Okay, so number two is with regards to presentation things which may be important subsequently later, right? But actually you can potentially address now. So the first presentation thing I think you can really improve at the start is to try to have a bit more figures and tables, particularly the table, I think a very nice table to basically describe what are the rights and privileges of the different immigration regimes in Singapore would be very good. So you can imagine a table with each column, say maybe work permit, S pass, and then employment pass, right? Those are the three things. And then horizontally, you can say, okay, what are their rights? What are their volume, right? What are their typical occupation? What are their quotas, right? So on and so forth. So at a glance, in one table, you can basically present to the reader exactly what you are trying to pinpoint that is different from usual North American or European consensus, right? And then number two, in terms of presentation, it was a little bit, not a little bit, it was actually quite difficult to try to understand the flow of your survey, right, that you were trying to propose. Actually, I usually find like charts quite easy to follow. So if you can have a chart to tell us how you will randomize into different groups and then how those groups will actually flow down to different questions or they will all answer similar questions, I think that would be very helpful, right, for people to follow your survey flow. Yeah, so those are just two kind of presentation details which I think would really help. And then number three, just very quickly looking through the survey, I think you could collect just two short, small comments. Number one, I think you could collect a handful more socioeconomic variables to actually test variation. And the socioeconomic variables, which I think would be very interesting, would be to ask the respondent, does your household employ a helper? Does your household employ a maid? Right? We will imagine a helper maid would be deemed as low income, low skilled worker, right? And if someone has experienced hiring a helper maid, they would have some sort of feelings, right? Because it's very visceral. This person is living in their household. Yeah. And then maybe another question about, well, if you employ a helper maid, do they help you take care of elderly, or do they help you take care of children, or do they help you take care of general household chores? You can imagine again, right? If they take care of elderly and children exclusively, you can imagine some respondents being very grateful, right, to these low-skilled workers, right? Instead of being resentful of these low-skilled workers who only just do grocery shopping, so on and so forth. Yeah. The second kind of socioeconomic variable that you can think about to look at variation is to ask the respondent, where do you work for? Do you work for in a multinational company, or do you work for in a local small and medium enterprise, right? That is more domestically focused. And of course, if you work in a multinational company, you can also ask them, in your estimate, right? How much of your company comprises of foreign workers? So you can get some sense of that, right? And that can also be an interesting variation to look at. And then finally, the other angle of the survey is you were trying to test, like, say, let's just put it plainly, outgroup racism towards mainland Chinese, right? And I would say that is okay if you have space for more space for your survey. The key, demographic group to try to test outward racism is actually Indians from India, right? If you follow, the local news, you will know that the word Sika, CECA, right, has become a sort of a dirty word, some sort of, by just mentioning this phrase, Sika, right, people has all sorts of ideas in their minds about, how that has been unfair to Singapore, how it connotes ideas of massive immigration from India into Singapore. So if you have space, right, you can potentially look at that. And then finally, I know that you mentioned you have various parts of the survey probing the different mechanisms about rights, job competition, spatial congestion, as well as outgroup racism. Particularly in that part of outgroup racism, I think it is important to think about people's views towards national identity, right? Immigration and national identity. And national identity is, again, a socioeconomic variable which can potentially probe, like how proud of you are being of being a Singaporean, right? How important is multiracialism to the Singapore national identity, right? And I think, probing the mechanism of national identity is really important in Singapore. I think in the chat box, someone has also mentioned this idea of new immigrants being unable to assimilate into Singaporean society is a big problem, right? With the idea of Sika and mainland Chinese. So if you have a survey to be able to disentangle how much is it in job competition, how much is it in terms of national identity, that would be very important. I'll just leave you with this parting thought, right? Last year, I actually went to the manifesto launch of the Singapore Democratic Party, the SDP, an opposition party that is competing in the upcoming Singapore elections. And so again, one more point is actually you might think about timing your survey, maybe a little bit later, not so close to the elections. I don't know. Maybe closer to the elections might be better. But immigration is going to be a very, very salient issue during the elections. And during the manifesto launch of the SDP, Dr. Chee Soon Juan, who was the leader of the SDP, he actually showed one PowerPoint slide, right, throughout his entire presentation. And that PowerPoint slide had immigration in the middle and connected to 4 different boxes. The 4 different boxes were, if I remember correctly, I could be wrong, but I remember correctly. Number 1, cost of living. Number 2, housing. Number 3, jobs. And number 4, national identity. And it is, in his view, in the SDP's view, it seems immigration is tied to all this. And the idea is that, there's too much immigration in Singapore that is causing us all these problems in these 4 main areas. So that is a kind of like, parting thought to just say that, if you can do a survey to get a grip on people's sentiments towards these issues, I think is really, really important work that you're trying to do.
Thanks.
Hey, great. Thanks so much, Elvin and Rebecca. So what we'll do now is we'll have some questions already in the chat, which I'll read. I'm going to collect some of them first. But Rebecca, if you like, can you could give a very, very quick response to Elvin, because I think some of the points are quite similar. I'll throw one other thing in there for you to consider too, which is related to Elvin's point of timing, because I think there's a tension about whether a lot of these views of immigrants are innate. There's some sort of baseline environmental view, or are they driven by certain events? Could be election, could be some accident happening somewhere. We saw during COVID, right? The infection clusters got lots of different kinds of reactions. Or it could be particular individuals driving certain sentiments, right? And if you're just going to do a sort of one shot, right? It's a snapshot. So to tease apart these sorts of event-driven effects may be a bit challenging. You want to just take a quick answer, and then I'll so I can go through the.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian and Elvin. Yeah. So, Elvin, the question about domestic helper debt makes total sense. Thanks so much for that suggestion. And your point about testing people's views towards national identity, and patriotism. Sean and I we're talking about it, and we really wanted to use NS, because I think NS is quite like, when you're thinking about like what it means to be Singaporean, like NS keeps coming up, and we're trying to like find a question that would get at that, to kind of like skirt around just like asking right out, like, how patriotic are you, So if anyone has any suggestions about that, that'd be great. And Ian, yeah, we've been talking about the election, and it's a really good point that like it is a very it's going to like bring up a lot of feelings, I guess, during this time. So maybe so it's kind of like a trade-off of like whether we should do it or not close to the election. But thanks to both of you, and yeah, let's collect questions.
Yeah, so we've got quite a few questions from Madeline Chu. So she asks about assimilability, right? So I suppose where I would take this is, when you look at what your survey looks at is sort of immigrants sort of as a whole, but the question is, are there different attitudes towards different kinds of immigrants? Elvin talked a little bit about this in terms of in-group, out-group. So that's something that you might want to consider. And also Madeline also brings up a very interesting issue of timing, where it seems that the earlier waves of immigration from the PRC seem to have assimilated better. There seems to be less pushback, whereas later waves seem to get more of that. So I guess for your survey, somehow you need to account for that change over time, which goes back to something that Elvin and I had mentioned as well. And so I guess you might also want to consider how people look at Malaysian immigrants, right? because we have many. Actually, the biggest bulk I think are people from Malaysia. Um, so yeah, so all that gets to nativism, which Madeline also raised. Now, I guess this is a little bit more speculative in your case. So Hercules True raises other issue too. I guess you only know, right? It's when what are the reactions to highly skilled immigrants coming in? Do you get some sort of strong pushback, or he's arguing from the PRC domestic case, right? There's a lot of involution. People just sort of give up and don't want to do things. But that may be a little bit outside of your scope. Um, but yeah, so that's one thing. Madeline also has some questions about the sort of technical issues of immigration, which actually is relevant to your question. So if we disentangle, you talk about North America, but different, and I sometimes don't like this term West either because it is very confusing. Madeline brings out the right, I think, a very useful point that the immigration regime in Canada looks very different from the immigration regime in the United States, which is changing anyway. And you have different kinds of immigration regimes across different parts of Europe. So while I think a lot of the US literature informed stuff takes the US as a baseline, which you somehow extrapolated to the West, but I'm not sure how much we can baseline from that sort of single country specific study. If you could talk about these issues, I know it's quite a few. It'd be useful to sort of get the ball rolling. Thanks, Madeline.
So I'll let my co-author Charlotte jump in if she thinks it's appropriate. But I just wanted to talk about Madeline's point because I think it's a really good point. And your point, Ian, about the West. So first of all, immigration in Singapore, you do need to find a job before you apply for a visa. And they're very dependent on the employers. Singapore does have this point-based system where it's for high-skilled immigrants, not for those on work permit. But for those on E-Pass, they actually are given points based on like diversity and their economic contribution. So while you're right, Canada does have more similarities. It's different from the US. I think, Charlotte, my main point is that in the West, or in Europe and in the US, Canada, high skilled and low skilled immigrants are given the same rights. They both have a path to citizenship, and they high and low skill have access to a lot of public goods and benefits. I sorry, there are a lot of questions. Sorry, I'm not quite sure what involution means.
Oh, involution is a phenomenon that
Oh,
is becoming increasingly has been a thing in the PRC for a while, where competition is
oh,
driving. That's more internal migration, but competition is driving a lot of people to just exit the job market. They would rather just stay at home, right? Lie flat, involution, that kind of idea.
yeah. So I'm not sure, but what I can say is that I've looked at focus groups done by, can't remember which survey but I found but what we read is that Singaporeans do say that immigrants from India, PRC, they don't have families, they don't have obligations, they come here and they can work like China 996, whereas we can, and how can we compete with that? So I don't think there's I mean I don't study this, but I don't think there's evolution, but there is like a push for the government to like stop this kind of competition from coming in, I think.
Right. So I guess on the nativism bit, what maybe you could talk a little bit about how you distinguish between the different groups of immigrants, because I think what Madeline is also driving towards is, when you have, and also Elvin too, right? So when, there's one response to mainland Chinese immigrants, there's another response to people from India, there's another response to Malaysians. There are also different kinds of responses to people from Taiwan, Hong Kong, Indonesia.
Yeah, so I think maybe we can get some feedback about this. we were thinking about what is a neutral immigrant group. I thought Malaysians are neutral. Maybe it's because so my family is from Malaysia and they immigrated, got Singaporean citizenship. And I think a lot of Singaporeans have experience with that. So when I think of like the most acceptable immigrants, I think probably from Malaysia, although please tell me if I'm wrong. But we really want to, I mean, that's why we're testing questions about mainland Chinese. I totally agree with Elvin. We definitely need to test immigration from India because the Sika issue has been really hot. But we do think that there is cultural differing levels. Singaporeans feel differing levels of cultural threat. And right now, like shout outs in the chat, we're kind of trying to skirt around the issue, but we obviously know that this is important. So feedback about like the most salient cultural issues would be great. Which are the most acceptable because we need a control group for one of the survey items we want to design in the follow-up survey. So that's why I'm asking.
Right. So we're getting more questions in the chat. So Lisa's asking, I think it's a little bit more specific. So you've sort of baselined the US, but the US immigration system, does have many different kinds of tiers. So you sort of said, okay, there's high skilled, there's low skilled, but there's Lisa specifically raises H2A, B, but also we're looking at OPT for people who are students, which expires, right? If they don't get an H1B. And then there's for Singaporeans, right? There's H1B1, which also doesn't allow a path. So structurally, right, it seems a lot more complicated than just, high skilled, low skilled. If you could sort of talk about that, that it could be helpful. And I suppose the other things to sort of bring in, Madeline sort of talking about, okay, well, what do we, how much of the sort of sentiments are driven by insufficient or at least perceived insufficient social programs in Singapore, right? So Singapore has some, but notoriously that's something that is highly contentious. So there's that, and also we have CI Tan who says well, maybe it's a numbers, it's essentially suggests it's maybe a numbers game, right? So from the early 2000s there were fewer, and then they started increasing, and so that the increase, maybe there's effort to modulate, but I suppose the increased context of changes perceptions in ways that perhaps are not reversible. But yeah, so maybe you could think about some of these issues too.
Yeah, so yes, the US does have like I think they call it the Braceros program for agricultural workers, but that program is always in flux. Depending on administration, they cancel it, they put it back in. So I would say that unlike in Singapore, where we'll take in like lots of immigrants, but only a portion of them get rights. In the US, if they do take in a lot of immigrants and then restrict the rights they only restrict the rights for like a minority, whereas we restrict the rights, I would say, for the majority. So I would argue that the institutional environment is still different. Yeah, Melon, I definitely, there is dissatisfaction with the government too. We need to talk about that, especially with the GEs coming. But certainly, like immigration is always tied to like issues of cost of living and job, like availability of jobs. So for the flow of immigrants, actually in 2009 or 2010, there was a sharp drop off. If you look at the charts, there's a sharp drop off in PRs being accepted, and I think immigrants in general. So the government did respond, to this pushback against immigration, and of course, there's like the accumulation of the stock of immigrants, but I think there is a mismatch in between like what has been done policy-wise and what people feel like in terms of like lots of like mainland Chinese food courts. I totally agree. I mean, there was that like op-ed or article in the Straits Times about like Singaporean Chinese feeling like their culture is being taken over by mainland Chinese culture, and we were really interested in that, to be honest. I mean, we were thinking about like looking at different neighborhoods and collecting the the like mala xiangguo versus like bak chor mee places, so kind of to like look at like what has like a lot of mainland Chinese versus like more like Singaporean Chinese foods. But logistically that's so difficult. But yeah, it's something we're interested in.
Yeah, so okay, so there are a couple of things here. I mean, the immigration policies are always in flux, right? There's also now the sort of tax scheme that Elvin raised, but there are also the investment immigrants that some people. So then it doesn't even have to do with skills; it just has to do with money, right? Where the state claims that it creates jobs and brings wealth in, but people suspect that it drives up property prices. So those are things that you might want to sort of take note of. And Ruby Thagarajan, who works with transnational families, also likes to bring up the fact that with she works on with transnational families, both high skilled and un or low skilled. But it seems that that for both groups, the sentiment, at least her observations, that the sentiment seems to be quite negative, right? And they seem to be having one foot in and one foot out, and this gets to the other point about structure and institutions, which you talk about. Singaporeans, clearly there's a lot of importance put onto NS, right? People think it's a rite of passage. So there's a view that was new citizens, PRs, or immigrants don't have to do that. So it's in effect as a tax, as a type of tax that Singaporeans see that they have to endure, and immigrants don't. So perhaps that's something you want to consider too. With if people have how people view immigrants, high skill or low skill, whether they've done NS or not, whether or their children have done NS. That might be something to throw in there.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely something that we want to look at. Maybe we'll have a question about like whether they think that PRs and new citizens have to do NS once they apply. So
Or if they've done NS, would you change your
or
opinion?
I see. So if they've done NS, okay. And yeah, in terms of for Ruby's point, I I think there is this sentiment for a lot of high skilled immigrants that they use Singapore as a stepping stone. I'm not sure how to test that, but I know it's quite a common sentiment.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, there's there's the temporary migrant stuff as well. But I think CI Town also brings up this point, right, where maybe some of the sentiment in Singapore is because we're so small. So the sense of cultural threat, or the sense of being overwhelmed, or in fact the sense of vulnerability, which is drilled into many Singaporeans from young, right? Maybe that is part of the reaction that we have towards the unfamiliar, right? So I don't know. That might be something you want to consider as well when you sort of do the survey.
Yeah, we're looking into spatial congestion, which Charlotte has done work on. Yeah, and the even in countries like Australia, the US, Europe, there's lots of land. Even if there's lots of land, immigrants often move to cities.
Right.
So there is the feeling of congestion. But sorry, Elvin raised his hand.
Oh, Elvin, yeah.
Yeah, just to say very simply, I think if you were to just ask for some baseline support, right? Do you support immigration of high-skilled immigration or low-skilled immigration? I think if you ask it now, if you ask it next month, the baseline support will be very low, right? It'll just be very low because of what's the rhetoric surrounding the elections and the accumulation of immigrants over the past few years. So, the difference between high-skilled and low-skilled immigration from that very low base, I'm not sure how interpreting that difference might be a little bit different from interpreting a difference at a very high base, right? That might be one consideration you might want to think about. So let's say, let's say a 10% difference between 20 and 30% versus a 10% difference between 70 and 80%, right? That difference, you might want to interpret differently. The second thing is, given that the baseline support for immigration, my expectation is very low. Ian's point about national service, I think will flip it all the way around, which is if someone some immigrant reveals that they have done national service, then people would say, oh, I would predict that people would say, oh, this guy deserves to be immigrated to Singapore because he has done national service. And support for that guy would be like 80, 90%, right? Would flip totally around. And I think that is how strong the national service as an identity to Singapore is.
As an
Right?
institution as well.
As an institution, as something people feel that contributes to the broader welfare of society, right? It's a kind of rite of passage, right? And I know many people till now still do not accept Singapore citizens because they have never done national service, right? Like, for example, some of our politicians, they are new citizens, they have not done national service, and every time election comes around, people will say this guy has not done national service. He does not deserve to be a cabinet minister. He does not deserve to be a politician, right? So national service as an identity marker, as an institution, is really important to whatever kind of skilled, low or high skilled immigration. And I hope that you can kind of probe it.
Right, and also Ruby brings in this other point, which is related, right? So apart from national service, another may be if they have already have kinship ties. So that may also change things because there's a view that people with kinship ties tend to integrate better. That may or may not be true, but at least that's the belief, right? So if that's the case, you could in your survey also ask, well, if this person they already have family here, especially if they have family who have been here for a long time, does that change your view? So that gets you perhaps a little bit more traction on the sort of different variables that might affect this view towards immigrants and different kinds of immigrants.
Wait, so by the kinship ties, do you mean like the family ties are with Singaporeans or just with people?
I mean, okay, you may have the problem of having too many questions, but I suppose it can be, but you can test both, right? So if they already have family here, that is actually an interesting question because there is one view that says there's this sort of chain migration. They bring their families over, and that's how they drive the prices up and they change the character of Singapore. That's one argument. The other argument is, okay, if they already have family who are well integrated here, when they come over, they assimilate better. So you hear both arguments, but we don't know at this point which one actually people believe in more. You just hear both.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so Ruby's research is on Singaporean family members. Okay.
Right. So immigration is clearly important all around the world, and in Singapore it is as well, but it's complicated in very different ways from the United States.
Yeah. So sorry, the NS point is like really important to us. And we're trying to find like a parallel or category to kind of make it more comparative with the other country.
Well, in the US, you do have immigrants who join the military, right, in order to have a fast track to citizenship. So you may want to consider that. Are those people seen as somehow different?
That's true. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, CI brings up this point too that there is a view that there's a loophole. So when people apply for citizenship, it may matter. Although there is an effort. Oh, you could probably bring this in. There is an effort, right, with the whole SAF volunteer ski corps to have people sort of serve NS, but not really. And whether that makes a difference, I don't know. This is stuff that is really we see in Singapore as observations, but we don't really know the effect. So you're clearly breaking new ground here to help us understand our own society.
We did want to test about the SAF volunteer scheme. Is it seen as the same as NS, or is it not?
Anecdotally, no, because the level of training and commitment and all that is a bit different. But that's just anecdotal, right? So we don't know until we sort of get data and test it. Okay, we are at the witching hour. So I don't want to hold people on hold people for too long, but thank you all so much for attending, and thank you so much, Rebecca, for sharing your paper with Charlotte, and Elvin. Thanks so much for being a great commentator. I hope to see all of you again at our subsequent Junior Scholar Seminar. I mean, every Junior Scholar Seminar, we learn a lot, right? So it's great to see new research about Singapore.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.